Welcome back to the Real News Network. We're continuing our series of discussions on undoing the New Deal. Before we get into it, please remember we're in our winter fundraising campaign. Every buck you donate will be matched, and it's a critical time for us. We got to raise a significant piece of our budget, or we can't keep doing Real News, and we can't keep doing shows like the undoing of the New Deal. So please, if you haven't donated yet, click. If you want to donate again, click again. If you have donated and you've done as much as you can, thanks very much. Okay, we're going to get right into it. If you haven't watched the lead up to this, it's really worth doing because the whole thing is kind of chronologically proceeding from the 1930s on. Now, joining us to continue this discussion is Gerald Horne. Gerald is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, and the Origins of the United States of America. Thanks for joining us again, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
So before we kind of pick up, again, a bit of Reagan and then move into Clinton, you wanted to make a comment about FDR. Go ahead.
Well, I think that in our previous analysis, we were relatively charitable towards FDR, and I don't think that was necessarily misplaced. What I mean is we were trying to explain how and why it was that so many New Deal programs tended to exclude Black workers. And can you lay that wholly at the doorstep of the occupant of the Oval Office, or should you do a broader analysis of the race and class forces that he was confronting? That is to say, the opposition in Dixie, not only by Dixiecrats, that is to say political leaders within his own party, but also a mass movement amongst many white workers who were upset about any uplifting of Black workers. What was interesting about FDR, what he was trying to do an end run around that by having a dual partnership with his spouse, Eleanor Roosevelt, who in many ways was saying certain progressive things that the president himself felt that he was not able to say because of this relationship with the Dixiecrats. And I think that same kind of political configuration that we're confronted with, which is really screwy in the United States, that is to say, we don't have a Labor Party that represents labor, Black, white, brown, etc. We have these parties of mixed class formations, a Democratic Party that has unions at its base and has at the elite level many Wall Street elements who are not necessarily dependent upon an organized labor force. And then you have a Republican Party that has many white working class and middle class folk at its base, but then has at its apex many bosses who are dependent upon a broad swath of working class labor. As long as you have that rather dysfunctional class and political party configuration, you're going to have difficulty pushing through any kind of social democratic measure.
Okay, so let's move into, in terms of Reagan, we talked about he takes advantage of this moment that the legislation of the 1960s sent a lot of what were Dixiecrats, Southern racist members of the Democratic Party, over to the Republican Party. There's resentment in the white working class about many of these reforms. Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, which did benefit Black workers, certainly more directly than New Deal measures in the 1930s. And at a time of globalization, it takes a great big leap. To my mind, it's a whole other conversation, but it has a lot to do with the development of digitization. You can now rationalize international production in a way that you never could. And in the 1980s, this really starts to take off, weakening the power of American workers and American unions. But big government, to a large extent, actually really means undo social programs. When Reagan says, let's have smaller government, he doesn't mean let's have a smaller military. He means let's get rid of social programs, those from the 30s and from the 60s. And that message tends to resonate in his favor.
Well, the signature issues of the Reagan administration, from my point of view, is, first of all, the attack on the air traffic controllers who go out on strike and the union is destroyed.
The union demands are 17 times what had been agreed to, $681 million. This would impose a tax burden on their fellow citizens which is unacceptable. The Congress passed a law forbidding strikes by government employees against the public safety. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
That sends a signal to organized labor with regard to what they will be capable of doing.
Yeah, just quickly for people that don't know the story, give us like 30 seconds on what happened.
Well, the air traffic controllers are the people at airports who help to make sure that planes take off and land safely. They went out on strike in the early days of the Reagan administration, and rather than engaging in collective bargaining, what Mr. Reagan did was basically hire scabs.
And let me just add, they actually endorsed Reagan in the election because they had a letter from him where he promised not to do this, and then he went ahead and exactly did it, which is he hired scabs. There's an actual letter on file where Reagan promises the union that he'll respect their right to strike.
So that sends a signal to the AFL-CIO, to the labor movement. And this comes in the wake of decades of counter-reaction and counter-revolution to the New Deal programs of the 1930s, speaking of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, which was a Magna Carta for the organizing of the United Auto Workers. The first blow in that counter-revolution is struck in 1947 with the Taft-Hartley Act. The second blow is struck with regard to the purging on spurious grounds of anti-communism of some of the most militant and left-wing labor leaders. One of the few to survive was Harry Bridges, of course, of the San Francisco Longshoremen's Union, but he was an exception. The other aspect of the Reagan years, other than the attack on organized labor, is the trope of the so-called welfare queen. That is portrayed and depicted as a black woman who comes into a grocery store with food stamps and buys steaks and champagne while some poor white working class person stares agape.
Yeah,
now, obviously
eating with cans of Spam because they can't afford real meat.
Right. Obviously, this is wholly fictitious. I mean, you can't buy champagne with food stamps. But in any case, it was very effective because it was tapping into an underlying racist sentiment. And then we know that Mr. Reagan's anointed successor, George H.W. Bush, carried that forward with this Willie Horton trope used so effectively against his Democratic competitor, Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, which was this effective commercial about a black prisoner who gets a leave from Governor Dukakis and then goes out and creates and commits havoc.
This is the Willie Horton commercial.
Exactly.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So this helps to soften up the working class on a racist basis, and that prepares the ground for the rise of William J. Clinton. And I think that the signature aspects of his administration was not only NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which helps to send many auto plants south of the border into Mexico. It's not only the so-called welfare reform, ending welfare as we know it, as he put it, which was another staggering blow against the social safety net.
Before you move on, Gerald, but talk a bit about welfare reform, because it's a very significant undoing of the 1960s legislation.
Well, welfare reform is fundamentally an effort to restrict what was called aid to families with dependent children. That is to say, once again, it played upon these racist stereotypes of Black women having children out of wedlock, if I may be permitted to use that phrase, and lazy Black men who were not taking care of their children, and therefore the government has to step in to fill the breach. Mr. Clinton, admittedly under pressure from the Republican right wing, surrendered and capitulated and tried to restrict the AFDC program, which was part of an overall retreat with regard to constructing a reasonable safety net, and then was complemented, if you like, by his initiatives with regard to crime, the so-called crime bill, which opens the door for the acceleration of the so-called prison industrial complex. You have this great acceleration of the imprisonment of Black men in particular, and increasingly Black women during the Clinton years. Ironically enough, you may recall that the confrontation that Hillary Rodham Clinton encountered when she was running for president in 2016 with young Black activists who were trying to get her to walk back some of the statements she had made during her husband's administration that helped to give momentum to this so-called crime bill and the acceleration of the prison industrial complex.
And I think it's an interesting thing. If you read Chuck Schumer's biography or his book, he talks about this as an actual straightforward political calculation that the Democratic Party had to look tougher and stronger than the Republicans. So they had to be tougher on crime. They had to be tougher on welfare because it's a political positioning they thought would be popular for them, which again always has an underlying racist card underneath it as part of the support for this. I think it's also, and I think we should talk a bit about this, it's a moment where finance starts to, which is always powerful, but in the 90s, finance took on enormous strength in terms of their political influence, the concentration of ownership. And you have the elimination of Glass-Steagall, which is the legislation that mitigates how much banks can speculate with people's money and such. And I think what's important here is the Democrats and Clinton are very much embody this moment. It's not just under pressure of the Republicans, it's under pressure of Wall Street who pay for their political campaigns.
Well, absolutely. I mean, once again, you get into the screwy political configuration of these parties. The Democratic Party not only being a party of organized labor, not only being a party of Black workers, which has just been exemplified in the vote in Alabama just a day or two ago, but it's also the party of Wall Street. That is to say, the party of the elite that is not as dependent upon masses of workers, particularly organized workers. And their campaign donations helped to fuel the Bill Clinton campaign and subsequently the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign. But in return, they asked for a loosening of financial regulations, which helps to turn the US economy into one grand casino, which then comes crashing down in 2007, 2008, which impoverishes many, the Black working class and Black middle class not least, but also, ironically enough, helps to give rise to the so-called Tea Party movement, which instead of turning en masse against the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, in some ways they help to drag both political parties to the right. Because recall that the Tea Party movement comes into play in opposition to the government bailing out distressed working class and middle class homeowners. It doesn't come into play because of this loosening of financial regulation that turns the economy into one grand casino.
Right. I just want to go back to talking about the Clinton period. I had lunch with I know one of the leaders of one of the big international unions, and I had lunch with him and some of his staff and his political consultant. This was in D.C. And I said to them, much what you're saying, the Democratic Party is these multiple classes, and you have Wall Street and you have the trade unions and workers. I said, but you guys don't fight for leadership of the Democratic Party. You concede leadership to Wall Street. In the final analysis, you end up with Wall Street approved candidates. On the whole, I said, why do you do that? And the answer from the political consultant, and the union leader is nodding his head, was because they're the only ones that have the money to fight the Republicans. And the Republicans are just so much worse than those sections of the elites that we deal with in the Democratic Party, that we're dependent on them to have the cash to fight elections. I wonder what you think of that, although it's an interesting thing now. Sanders has actually shown that there's no longer any need for that dependency. But the corporate Democrats are still in bed with Wall Street.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking of an article that appeared in the Financial Times of London a few days ago about British politics and about how a certain sector of the British elite is becoming more favorable, believe it or not, to Jeremy Corbyn, the left-wing leader of the Labour Party. And that's because the Tories have proven themselves to be so dysfunctional, the way that they're handling Brexit, and the way, from the elite's point of view, they're jeopardizing the British economy by withdrawing from the European Union. Some of them are pushing for this so-called hard Brexit that will leave Britain's economy in some ways stranded, and that makes them more favorable to the Labour Party of Corbyn because of their pushing a so-called softer Brexit. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, will there come a time when the elite of the US of A decides that they need a different political configuration in terms of parties if they're going to continue to survive? I don't think they're thinking that way as we speak, but if Britain is any guide, they may have to start thinking that way sooner rather than later.
All right, let's move on with this undoing the New Deal. How do you assess the Obama years in the context of this New Deal and 1960s legislation and the process we're talking about?
Well, I think that many are correct to be disappointed with the administration of President Obama. And I would say the disappointment not only comes on the domestic scene, that is to say with regard to the stimulus, because of course he could argue that given the fact that it was difficult to scare up any Republican votes for this multi-billion-dollar stimulus of 2009, that he was constrained and constricted. But I think that the disappointment of the Obama years comes disproportionately from his foreign policy. That is to say, the apparent inability to embark on a new and different path that at the same time could have possibly affected the correlation of forces in the United States. And I look particularly at the major blunder of the Obama years, which was the 2011 invasion and overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which put wind in the sails of the right-wing hawks, which they could then parlay into domestic gain in Washington, D.C., but also sent a signal to many developing countries that they needed to bend the knee to Uncle Sam, which in turn helps to accelerate this movement of runaway shops abroad. To me, that was the major disappointment.
Well, let me add, can I add one thing to that? During the, when Barack Obama becomes president, he controls both houses of Congress. The economy is an absolute disaster. There's a real opportunity. Many people asked him to be the next FDR and to take on the issue of banking, which means the possibility of even nationalizing a bank instead of a privatized solution to the auto industry and putting it onto the backs of auto workers, which he did. All the various measures, there was a real moment there, an FDR potential moment. Instead, Obama is who he is, but he was an extension of Clinton. He certainly wasn't an FDR.
Well, it's not only that, but I think that if labor leaders had been closer to the Obama administration than they thought they were, they would have pushed harder for labor law reform. Because if there had been significant labor law reform, this would have empowered the working class itself to push for more social democratic measures.
Well, Obama promised them the Employee Free Choice Act, and I interviewed the guy who was head of the AFL-CIO at the time, who said he would eat his shoe if Obama did not pass the Employment Free Choice Act, which would have allowed unions to organize more easily, and of course they didn't even put it up for a vote in Congress.
Well, once again, one of the points I would like to stress today is the interrelationship between foreign and domestic policy. I mean, for example, going back to the Clinton years, one of the signature aspects of the Clinton administration was the great push to admit China into the World Trade Organization. This was part of a larger foreign policy scheme. That is to say that this was part of the payoff that China got for embarking on this anti-Soviet path beginning in the 1970s. Those at the top of the US political system did not recognize that China would not be satisfied with being a cheap labor force forevermore, and that they would develop their economy to the point now where it's in the passing lane. And it's interesting to note, as we've mentioned before, that part of the gospel of Steve Bannon right now, the major ultra-rightist force in the United States today, is not only pushing for these sort of alt-right, right-wing populist programs and politicians, but also this holy crusade against China, which it seems to me is a direct outgrowth of events that were beginning in the Clinton years, that is to say China as the juggernaut, and which, if not checked, that is to say if Bannon is not checked, he's going to lead the entire planet into disaster.
Thanks for joining us, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you. Don't forget, we're in our winter fundraising campaign. If you like the kind of history we do, like the undoing of the New Deal, we need your support. We can't do this kind of work without dollars. It takes, for example, just to produce this kind of segment. Well, it takes a host, it takes a producer, it takes a couple of guys in the studio, it takes a studio, we have a building here, it takes an editor who puts in all the archival footage and turns these interviews into something closer to a documentary film. It takes a lot of people to do this, and a lot of people means money. So please, if you like what we do, help us do it. Click the donate button and help us make real news. Thanks for joining us on the Real News Network.